Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the Connecticut Green Bank Quarterly Stakeholder Webinar. We will be getting started in just a few minutes while we wait for the last folks to sign on. Thanks. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Connecticut Green Bank Quarterly Stakeholder Webinar. Joining us today, we'll have Bryan Garcia, the President of the Connecticut Green Bank, and Eric Schrago, the Director of Operations of the Connecticut Green Bank. Next slide, please. So our agenda for today will include an update on the sweeps and restructuring, updates on the progress of each sector for this fiscal year, and Eric will have an update with the description of our methods for measuring and assessing impact. And finally, Bryan will have some other news in the 2018 legislative session. We will end with questions, but of course, please use the question box on the GoToWebinar to ask questions as we go, and we'll get to them at the end. So with that, I will turn this over to Bryan Garcia to start us off.
Great. Thank you, Ed. Thank you for that introduction, and welcome, everybody. Thank you for those on the East Coast spending your lunchtime with us here today, and those on the West Coast, your early morning. Wanted to acknowledge Eric, who's joining us today. Usually at each one of these quarterly webinars, we have a a different member of the team joining us, and Eric is going to walk us through what we're doing on some of our impact metrics in our evaluation framework. So excited to have him with us here this morning. Why don't we start us off by me providing an update on the sweeps and restructuring. It's been a while since we've had this conversation, but a lot has transpired in Connecticut. So what I wanted to do was to spend a little bit of time updating all of you with regards to what happened at the end of last year's legislative session, specifically with regards to the state budget. Just to provide a foundation from which the budget sweeps occurred, the legislature, the Connecticut General Assembly, was really dealing with some pretty significant budget deficits over the course of the two-year budget period. So from FY 2018 and FY 2019, the state was looking at a two-year budget of about $42 billion and trying to close a $3.5 billion budget deficit. So it was quite an extensive legislative session last year in 2017 from January through June, and that continued on through the summer and into the fall as the legislature worked towards a bipartisan budget. A budget ended up being approved at the end of October, a bipartisan budget, and as a component of that budget were several sweeps of a number of different funds that we all care about in the sustainable energy space. So the Green Bank for fiscal year 2018 and fiscal year 2019 was swept $14 million a year for each of those 2 years. More than 50% of the annual revenues that we received coming into the Green Bank. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, $10 million a year for each of those 2 years is being diverted to the general fund of the state of Connecticut. The Green Bank receives 23% of those allowance proceeds, so roughly $2.3 million for each of the next 2 fiscal years from RGGI will be going back to the general fund. And lastly, our partners at the Conservation and Load Management Fund, who administer energy efficiency programs through our 2 utilities, Eversource Energy and Avangrid, also received sweeps to their budgets to the tune of $117 million. So it was quite an extensive period last year and into this year with regards to those sweeps. And what I wanted to talk a little bit about now was how we are restructuring given those sweeps. So immediately after the budget was signed on October 31st of 2017, we went into an immediate restructuring mode. And for all of you who have had to deal with these sorts of restructuring, what you quickly realize is that everything becomes very cash flow focused. We had to simplify the businesses that we operate at the Green Bank, focus on our priorities, and work to establishing a plan to manage our cash flow. So what we discovered going through that intensive month and a half long period with our board of directors was effectively that we operate 2 businesses. One is an incentive business where we are required by public policy to support up to 300 megawatts of new residential solar PV installs by the end of 2022. We do that through our residential solar investment program. The interesting thing about that incentive business is that we receive cost recovery for supporting those incentives. And we do that by trading renewable energy credits that come from those projects. And because of our partnership through the policy with the utilities purchase those renewable energy credits from us over a 15-year period through a master purchase agreement. So we set a price for the RECs, the utilities buy them from us over a 15-year period, and what we're working on now is securitizing those future streams of renewable energy credits to receive the cash today to allow us to manage our cash flow over the coming years. So that is a self-contained business. We call it our incentive business with the focus on supporting the implementation of the public policy to achieve 300 megawatts of solar. The second business, which is really what Green Banks do, is focusing on our investment side of the business. This is essentially clean energy finance. Our focus is to use the remaining ratepayer funds, RGGI funds that we receive in a way that we provide capital to projects, programs, or products where we expect to generate a return, principal and interest over the term of those financing facilities. And the goal now of that investment business is to achieve a break-even in terms of our operating expenses and revenues between a 4 to 7 year period. So we are focused now on a sustainability position or foundation by generating returns from principal and interest that's generated from our loan activity. And lastly, what we spent a lot of time doing over the course of the last 4 to 5 years has been attracting more private investment and supporting new programs and products in the affordable single-family, multifamily market segment. When you start to look at whether or not green energy is being deployed in low to moderate income households, we wanted to ensure that it was being deployed at scale in those market segments. Given our new focus on returns with regards to our investment business, one of the things that we're working on now is the creation of a nonprofit organization where we will house all of our lower return expectation programs and products, things like our low to moderate income solar PV and energy efficiency ESA programs through Posigen, things like our multifamily affordable housing line of products like the Sherpa and Catalyst loan. Those sorts of programs will be housed at the nonprofit, which will offer us as an organization not only some cost savings from the operational expense perspective, but now also a private independent vehicle that will allow us to raise capital, private capital, to support that important market segment. So we spent a lot of time over the course of the last 4 to 5 months really working on the legal structure of the nonprofit and working with the Office of State Ethics, because we will be transferring staff members from the Green Bank to this newly created nonprofit where we will house these products. So we received a recent advisory opinion in support of all of this, offering us guidance in terms of how we're to manage that going forward. So it was a lot of restructuring that we had to do in the latter part of last year, and we've been working very steadily on that over the course of this calendar year and are making significant progress on that. So from a high level, this is effectively a picture of the structure that I just talked about. The Green Bank, within the Green Bank, we will house our incentives and investment business. On the incentive side, as I mentioned, those funds will be cost recovered through the sale of solar home renewable energy credits with the utilities. On our investment side, between a 4 to 7 year period, we will become self-sustaining as the returns, the principal and interest from our different investments will cover our operations. And the nonprofit is going to not only help us serve the important mission that we have for underserved market segments and credits, but since we are able to transition staff from the Green Bank to the nonprofit, we will effectively be lowering our operating expenses because the state has a rather high overhead rate. So we're going to be able to save costs by doing this. So this is effectively the structure that we are now working on going forward. And I wanted to spend a little bit of time with you all this afternoon just providing you that overview of everything that we've had to work through over the course of the last 2 quarters since the sweeps of last year. So with that, why don't we transition then into how are we doing with regards to our progress to our fiscal year 2018 targets. And we're going to start off with the infrastructure sector. In this sector, we're making excellent progress towards our yearly goals for infrastructure. The numbers that you're looking at here are through 3 quarters of the fiscal year, but we are already nearly there in terms of meeting our full year's targets. So just to give you a sense of that, the capital deployed at about $120 million is about 90% towards our year-end target for this sector. We're seeing really good leverage at $12 of private funds to $1 of public funds, so we're able to maintain that objective that we're after. With regards to our deployment, over 90% of our capacity deployment is being met with 35 megawatts. So we only have a couple more megawatts to go, and in fact, we've already crossed that in April and May of this year. So, and lastly, the number of projects, we are right at, if not exceeded, those number of projects through the year. So we're making really good progress towards our fiscal year targets, which is to say a lot about our methodology and our focus in terms of allowing the private sector to work, even in light of budgetary public sector strains that we're experiencing. With regards to some takeaways, we did lose several programs as a result of the sweeps. We lost our anaerobic digester program, which was out there supporting food waste to energy, farm waste to energy projects, combined heat and power pilots. Those programs were eliminated as a result of the sweeps. We are at a high level 70% of the way towards our 300 megawatt residential solar PV target. So we're at 210 of our 300 megawatt target. And as I was mentioning in the incentive business conversation, we are currently working through a securitization where we are selling forward our solar home renewable energy credits from about 100 megawatts of residential solar PV projects. So Eric's going to talk about here in a little bit the green and social nature of some of those transactions. So we'll get into that in a second. We're also making really significant progress on the LMI market segment. You might recall back in December of 2014 when we had our webinar, UConn had just released the studies showing that we were leaving behind the low to moderate income market segment when it came to residential solar. I'm happy to report that not only does our data show it, but also Lawrence Berkeley National Labs just recently designated Connecticut as one of 4 states to reach parity. That is, that the number of owner-occupied single-family homes that are in low to moderate income communities are equally as likely to install solar PV as non-LMI communities. So that's a really big and important development for the state of Connecticut. And then lastly, before we move to the residential sector, we're really now focused on transitioning this residential solar investment program where we're at 210 megawatts of 300 megawatts to the new post-residential solar investment program structure. So I'll get into that in a little bit. All right, let's take a quick look. I've shown this graphic several times over the years. Usual things that we're seeing here, installed costs coming down, although if you look at 2017 to 2018, we see a little bump up there in installed costs. That is most likely the result of the U.S. imposed tariff on Chinese panels, but if folks have a question on that, maybe Ed will have a perspective on that later. So we're seeing a little bit of a bump there. But regardless of the bump, we're still seeing demand for solar PV do really well, which I think is an important point. Okay, so let's transition to the residential sector. It is also making great progress here towards our fiscal year 2018 goals. Capital deployment, number of projects, they're all near the 100% year-end target within or through 3 quarters. So we are making great progress, obviously, on our yearly targets. The key messages I want to leave with folks here are, as I was just mentioning, our progress on low to moderate income in residential solar PV. I also wanted to acknowledge our partners at the Clean Energy States Alliance, who just recently received the State Leadership in Clean Energy Awards. You had Massachusetts, New York, Oregon, Rhode Island, and Excel Energy out of Minnesota, along with Connecticut receiving one of these awards. And through our partnership with Posigen in our Solar for All campaign for low to moderate income households, we won an award for financial innovation, specifically around a solar PV lease and an energy efficiency, energy savings agreement structure, ESA structure, specifically targeted for LMI households. So one of the things we're seeing with our LMI solar lease and efficiency ESA is a high number of participating households also paying $10 more per month for more energy efficiency improvements upfront, deeper weatherization, and the like. So it's great to see the innovation around solar PV leasing being combined with an energy efficiency ESA and customers demanding both together through that structure. The Smarty loan, we saw a really high uptick this year in our Smarty loan uptake. We were providing interest rate buy-downs from our repurposed federal RSF funds, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act funds. In the past, we had applied those funds as loan loss reserves to pay for second losses through our local lenders. What we were finding was that there are very little delinquencies and defaults of the Smarty loans, so we moved those federal funds from second loan loss reserves to interest rate buy-downs so we could effectively catalyze new market participants using the Smarty loan in Connecticut. So now we see a lot more contractors, small family businesses working with their customers, offering their customers loans through their local lender as a result of that interest rate buy-down catalyst. So really, really good. We're seeing steady progress in our multifamily and affordable housing line of products. Here we're seeing a number of end users not only delivering deeper energy efficiency improvements in properties, but also non-energy related improvements to those properties, improving the health and safety of those buildings, which is really important because we're trying to improve the lives of those who are living in our multifamily housing. And lastly, as I was mentioning before, a lot of these products in the residential sector will be transitioning to the nonprofit as we roll out the nonprofit in July of this year. So I want to recognize both the infrastructure and residential teams for all the hard work that they've been doing over the course of this fiscal year, even within challenging fiscal times with regards to the state legislature. So let's switch gears here and work into the commercial and industrial sector. Overall, through 3 quarters, they are making progress towards the year targets. Roughly, overall, we're about 3/4 of the way to the targets, depending upon capital deployed, amount of megawatts deployed, and the number of projects. So hopefully this final quarter of this fiscal year, we will end up achieving our year-end targets. A couple of things to note is that we are on target to having our best CPACE year with regards to the number of projects. So that is great. We're seeing more projects, but we're also seeing the average value of a project come down. So I think this is the result of seeing more and more energy efficiency projects coming into our portfolio. We also had a really successful partnership with the Department of Economic and Community Development through our Energy on the Line campaign, which was focused on helping manufacturers lower the burden of energy costs by financing clean energy improvements on their projects. So we saw a really good uptake of that program, and obviously from that, a lowering of energy costs, which is important to the bottom line of our local manufacturers. We've been successful working through our Lead by Example program to help deploy more renewable energy to state entities. In this case, the Connecticut State College and University System working with us at the end of last year. We were one of the last clean renewable energy bonds recipients of federal support. So we've supported a number of solar PV projects on our colleges and universities, which over a 20 to 25 year period are going to help them lower the burden of their energy costs as well. So within this climate that we're all operating in, off of a need to reduce our operating expenses when it comes to the budget, this is great for Connecticut's colleges and universities. So I want to acknowledge all of our team for working really hard with the Attorney General's Office, CSCU, DEEP, and all the other partners to make this happen, as well as our partnership with Onyx, where we continue to support local installers, providing them with access to capital, to support underserved credits in Connecticut to help them deploy solar PV. So again, overall steady progress across all our different sectors for this fiscal year. So with that, we're going to transition here to Eric, who's going to provide an overview of our evaluation framework and speak to all the different pieces that we're pulling together to speak about the social impact of what we're doing. Eric.
Thanks, Brian. So the Green Bank a couple of years ago set out to standardize and put some structure around everything that we're doing as far as evaluation, measurement, and verification. And the end result was this evaluation framework, which serves as a guide and a set of standards which we're following in terms for all things EM&V. And this consists of some things that are final and some things that are a work in progress and some things that are still on our radar to be done. So starting out, we have our data collection and analysis protocol, which defines what we're collecting and where we're getting that information. The next thing are our societal benefits. So what are we getting from each of these data points? What do they feed down to? Next, we have our program experience and impact, which consists of surveys, external evaluations, and these are really where we're applying these societal benefits and saying what are the benefits that we think we should be getting from each of the programs, what we are actually getting. And finally, we have our customer data privacy policy, which is how are we safeguarding data that's ours and data that has been entrusted to us. So in today's discussion, what I'll do is I'll go through the societal benefits portion of this and walk through each of these methodologies that we've put in place. So kicking off, these societal benefit methodologies are how we come up with the various metrics, or how we are looking at the various metrics that we're hoping to get out of our programs. So the first one of these that we established was around jobs. And we as an organization, one of our primary roles is to really stimulate the economy in the state. We are an economic development organization amongst many other things. And so we partnered, and our predecessor agency partnered with the Department of Economic and Community Development, as well as Navigant, and with some input from our utility partners at Eversource and AvantGrid, to produce a study that really looked at what are the impacts in terms of jobs that come from the investment in clean energy and energy efficiency. The result was a 2009 study that said, okay, for each $1 million that are invested, here are the direct, indirect, and induced job years that are created, depending on the technology that's installed. In 2016, we partnered again with Navigant and DECD to refresh the study, and followed the same methodology, really refreshed the numbers, kicked the tires, made sure that worked. And we recently went through a new recent activity to update that again for 2017. And basically the way this works, we are able to say this is what has been invested or deployed to in terms of capital, specific technologies looking across all of our projects or at a specific program, and get a resulting numbers in terms of direct, indirect, and induced job years that result from that capital deployment or investment. Moving on to tax revenues. This is one of the newest areas that we started to look at, and it's really building on the work that we did with DECD and Navigant. Earlier this year, or towards the end of 2017, we engaged Navigant in partnership with the Department of Revenue Services to determine what are the tax revenues that are coming from our investment and our activities in the state. And the end result is a calculator that really builds off of the jobs calculator. And this calculator works by looking at the jobs that are created based off of all of these investments, and what are the taxes that then come from that. So it looks at personal income tax. So that is a direct result of the jobs that are created, average wages. We leveraged some studies done by NREL and what portion of that stays in state. We then, as part of the job study, also had estimates in terms of corporate income taxes, or not corporate income taxes, sorry, corporate profit margins, which we then leveraged for an estimate on corporate taxes. Similarly, we had estimates in terms of project splits on hardware versus labor, which we then leveraged to get sales tax revenues, obviously taking into account certain technologies that are tax exempt in the state of Connecticut. Moving on to our environmental impacts. We recently adopted an EPA-developed model known as AVERT to help us assess what our activities are doing for the air quality in the state. Previously, we've been using an old EPA model, and at the suggestion of our partners at the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, we started to look at the AVERT model produced by EPA. And AVERT stands for the Avoided Emissions Reduction Tool, Avoided Emissions in Generation Tool, sorry. And so AVERT is a unique model that takes into account the activities of the Green Bank or of any organization in terms of energy generation or savings. And depending on the type of technology, it applies that to the energy dispatch and displacement model. So it says if you're bringing online 30 megawatts this year of solar, this is what it's going to have the impact versus bringing on 30 megawatts of energy efficiency. It's going to affect what's dispatched differently, and it takes that into account. The outputs of the model are savings in terms of carbon dioxide emissions avoided, NOx and SOx emissions avoided, as well as particulate matter that we avoid. So building on what we've done with AVERT, we have implemented a public health model also developed by the EPA called COBRA, the Co-Benefits Risk Assessment. And COBRA is built to work right alongside AVERT. And it takes the outputs from AVERT in terms of NOx, SOx, and particulate matter and runs this through a regional air disbursement model. And so it can say, you can get as local or as regional as you'd like to on where you're saying these emissions avoidances occur. And then it determines the public health impacts in terms of dollars. So it looks at number of heart attacks in the average cost of those that have been avoided due to better air quality, number of days of work that people aren't missing, asthma cases that are not going to occur, asthma trips to the ER, deaths that are avoided, so on and so forth. It comes up with dollar values, and it produces a range of low to high in terms of those estimates. And our other ongoing task is really revisiting how we measure energy generation. And we've used estimates across the board in Green Bank in the past. One of the things that we really feel confident in is our ability to use real data. We have metering on all of our residential solar and a big portion of our commercial solar projects that we've done, and we're able to access that. Most of those in real time. And so what we're doing is we're really consolidating that into a single platform. We're building a data warehouse where we can cross-reference that generation versus other project data. And so we're really looking to leverage what was actually generated on for each of these projects. And that will then, in turn, feed our AVERT modeling and our COBRA modeling, as well as just our overall numbers of what is the clean energy that we've produced in the year. Similarly, we're looking at the non-solar energy generation technologies such as wind, CHP, fuel cell, and hydro, and how we actually can receive and make sure that we're monitoring the actual generation from those projects. and how we're keeping that up to date. In terms of other EM&D efforts, I mean, we're really looking to continue to build this out. Down the road, we will be looking at how do we assess the impacts of energy efficiency in the same way that we do measure energy generation. Moving on to what do we do with this? So, I mean, all of these have been great and are great talking points, and we think are ways we demonstrate our value and societal impact of all of our programs. But now we're actually putting this to use directly with our SHREC securitization. And we are seeking, and we have identified second and third party, external verifier and a third party assessor, let's say, who can help us certify our SHREC issuance according to the climate bonds principles. And we're going to do this on the basis of the air quality improvements that we're modeling with AVERT, and based off of the actual generation from the systems that are being backed by, and the SHRECs that are backing those issuances. And we will also be quantifying the public health impacts and having a third party verify and assess the stated impacts in terms of air quality and public health. Additionally, we're exploring the certification of these bonds as either a social or a sustainability bond based off of the impacts in terms of jobs in serving an underserved market. So that being an LMI or CRA compliance census tracts, or that the projects are taking place in distressed communities. Plus what we're doing in terms of public health and the demographics that are generally targeted or generally benefit from those public health improvements. So we think those are, by going down this road and by obtaining these certifications, it will really be an endorsement on the good that we're doing in terms of these projects and that the securitization is enabling.
Great. Thank you, Eric. Lots of great work there. You, Lucy, and others pulling all this data warehouse together and connecting all the pieces. You can imagine now that we have the systems talking to each other, all the opportunities presented by data, from Community Reinvestment Act credits all the way to social and green bonds, all the way to just general reporting. We've got a really robust data collection and management system now that's interconnected all of our different programs and databases. So great work getting all of that to this point. So now just kind of wrapping up here, I wanted to provide an overview on what just transpired at the Connecticut General Assembly with the end of the 2018 legislative session. So it really was about two big bills, a climate change bill as well as a clean energy bill. So Senate Bill 7 was just passed. That really establishes a midterm greenhouse gas emission reduction target of 45% less than 2001 levels by 2030, which accompanies the Global Warming Solutions Act of 2008, which established a long-term GHG emission reduction target of 80% below 2001 levels by 2050, which is consistent with the science around 2-degree temperature rise. There are also a number of measures there to address resiliency planning in the state. So a really, really important bill for climate mitigation and adaptation for Connecticut coming through Senate Bill 7. Then Senate Bill 9 really provided a foundation for a number of different things going on clean energy in Connecticut, from an expansion of the Class 1 RPS to 40% by 2030. It's currently at 20% by 2020, so it doubles that in over a 10-year period, while at the same time focusing on this effort of responsibly growing the clean energy market, reducing the alternative compliance payment from $55 to $40 starting on January 1st of 2021. So you've got an increase with the reduction of potential ratepayer policy cost impact on the other end. There is a transition to a net metering, from net metering to a tariff policy. I'll talk about that here in a second, supporting behind-the-meter installations for fuel cells, shared clean energy facilities, supporting Class 1 renewable energy, 50 megawatts of solar PV, commercial and industrial behind-the-meter, and a no-cap residential solar PV market. There were also some really important provisions in this bill that supported energy efficiency. As I mentioned earlier, the Conservation and Load Management Fund was swept significantly last year. There are some protections in this bill that shift things to what's called a conservation adjustment mechanism, which requires planning before any sweep can take place. There's a provision of the bill that allows for fuel-neutral treatment for how homes are heated to try to address the propane and heating oil issue with regards to the RGGI sweeps, as well as establishing efficiency targets for the next 6 years, 1.6 million MMBTU annual target for each of the next 6 years. I think that starts in 2019, which is great. So lots of important provisions in there for efficiency. And then lastly, for the Connecticut Green Bank, there are some clarifying non-impairment provisions, which are an important signal from legislators to private investment communities, given that the sweeps occurred last year. What this non-impairment provision does is it sends a signal that if the state breaks it, it has to fix it, therefore enabling us to continue to encourage more private investment, public-private partnerships in Connecticut. So really an important provision. Happy to go through it more with you all. But if you think about this, this is really about Connecticut. We invest in sustainable energy in Connecticut, and it's a series of policies here that are wisely and responsibly working towards scaling up clean energy in the state. And I'll just wrap up here with this last slide around net metering transitions to a tariff policy on a big picture level. So on the commercial and industrial side, just to be clear, on the ZREC and LREC projects that are currently out there, and those projects coming through this year, year 7, and next year, year 8, they are grandfathered into net metering. So they will have a 20-year period on net metering through 2039. So that's good. It's a good signal to those who have done it and to those who are looking to do it through the ZREC, LREC programs over this year and into next year. There are caps or targets for behind-the-meter commercial and industrial systems, 50 megawatts for commercial and industrial solar PV, 25 megawatts for shared clean energy facilities, and 10 megawatts for behind-the-meter fuel cells. So 85 megawatts a year over a 6-year period supporting behind-the-meter facilities. On the residential side, similar structure in terms of the grandfathering of existing facilities. We are focused on achieving our 300 megawatt policy target. All homes that participate in the RSIP are grandfathered into net metering and grandfathered for a 20-year period with regards to their systems. One of the things that we're going to be working closely on with industry, PURA, DEEP, the utilities, is trying to develop a pilot tariff that will sit alongside our residential solar investment program. So right now we have an upfront incentive and a performance-based incentive that gets paid out quarterly over a 6-year period. We want to work with the regulators and the industry to develop an economically equivalent tariff-based option so that customers would have a choice to pick that option so that we can begin to transition from a net metered structure to the new tariff-based structure. So we're looking forward to getting that underway. And as I mentioned before, on the residential side, there is no cap, and we're currently deploying about 45 to 50 megawatts a year of residential solar. So as we're able to transition from net metering to the new tariff structure, the goal will be to continue to ramp up that deployment. Well, first of all, to ensure an orderly transition, and then secondly, to begin to ramp up that deployment and just kind of unhandcuff the market and allow it to grow to its full potential. So those are just really a high-level overview for those out there who aren't into what's happening on the policy side on Connecticut. I wanted to give you just a high-level review of what's happening. So I think with that, we will open it up and take questions from the audience.
Okay. And just a reminder to everyone, if you have questions, now's the time, so please enter them into the questions box. And if you have anything that comes up afterward, of course, our contact info is up on the board here. So the first one I'll send to Bryan. This is a pretty easy one, I think. What happens if we hit our yearly program targets early?
So great question. One of the things that we've been working really hard to do as an organization is to not have the market reliant so much on our activity as much as it is to realize its own potential. So if we set a target of 40 megawatts in a year and we budget incentives to that 40 megawatts, the last thing that we want to do is to stop providing support to that market if we hit that target early. So therefore you get the policy innovation around the securitization and the SRECs, which allows us to continue to support those programs with the incentives while at the same time lowering the incentives, right? So we've done a good enough job working with industry over the course of the last 5 to 6 years, lowering the incentives, the REC-based incentives for the RSIP by over 80%. And as a result of the sweeps last year, you know, we were able to isolate ourselves from that problem. So we can set a target, we can budget to the target. If the market is going to exceed it, we'll find a way to work through it. The last thing we want to do is to prevent your businesses from growing. So we've learned from our predecessor that when you stall markets or when you adversely impact markets because of their over-reliance on incentives, you can effectively destroy businesses. So we're able to manage through that now given our policy innovation and given how we're handling the financing of these projects.
Thanks, Bryan. Next question, are there any expectations for our pace?
Good question. So this question comes up every year. It comes up from the industry, the finance industry, interested in our pace. Here's my observation. Our pace has a number of challenges that it as a program is dealing with nationally, given the treatment by the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. So those are issues that really are preventing Connecticut from a policy perspective of being supportive of our pace. A lot of our goals from a policy perspective are, in this case, would be to get our local banks and our local lenders supportive of such a product. But in this case, they haven't been, given the national issues surrounding our pace. So I don't have any. I don't have a positive outlook for our pace in Connecticut per se. We do have the Smarty loan with regards to our local community banks and credit unions that offer really inexpensive long-term capital. So our local lenders will now go out to 20 years. They will provide loans up to $40,000 unsecured. So we've really worked hard to engage our local lending community, our local community banks and credit unions and CDFIs to help the state meet its energy policies on resi. So that's to say I'm not as bullish on our pace as I was in the past, but I feel like we have an option, contractors have an option, customers have an option in our local banks and credit unions.
Okay. So this question is kind of building off the first one. Do you expect the transition to tariffs to slow down the installation of residential solar?
So as we're currently in our planning process for the next fiscal year, this is kind of the question that we're thinking about. One could actually envision speeding up of deployment underneath the current structure because there may be installers out there who are saying, get your net metering while it's available. One can envision a slowing down as well as on the other end a speeding up. I guess what we would advise is continue your business, of selling solar PV to customers based on how you're doing it. And we are going to work together with industry and the regulators to ensure the orderly transition from the current structure to the new structure by putting in place a tariff structure that is, reasonably economically equivalent to where we are today. So I guess that's to say I actually expect things to pick up and not slow down. But Ed, you might have your own perspective in terms of what you're seeing now.
Well, actually, that kind of opens up the next question here, or comment in here, was that net metering is easy for homeowners to understand. It's easier for installers to explain. The new system, being that it's new, could cause some uncertainty, and even though it won't be in effect for a few years at least, the difference in that tariff and in that repayment structure could, the uncertainty could cause some folks to turn away from solar because they don't understand it.
Good. So the important policy thing here is that we have a pilot to transition from here to there, from net metering to the tariff. So that's going to be our focus over the course of the next 6 to 12 months, is getting something in place that will help contractors begin to test what the message is for a fixed rate tariff. There are currently two options that customers can choose from in the post-net metering world. One is a pure tariff structure, which says that they will be paid, let's say 20 cents, I'm just making up a number, 20 cents per kilowatt hour for the kilowatt hour produced from their solar PV system that is inclusive of the electricity and the renewable energy credit for a period of 20 years. So it's a fixed price. What's interesting there is when you think about retail net metering today, we have one utility in Connecticut that sells at 21 cents per kilowatt hour and another one that sells for 17 cents per kilowatt hour. So really a fixed price tariff is trying to just address is trying to address some of the disparities in what is a retail rate that one house across the street may be different than the other. The second choice customers will have is whether or not to take the excess tariff the excess power going back to the grid tariff. So if you're simultaneously producing power from the solar PV system and consuming it at your home, you'll get the retail rate. But if you are, for example, gone in the middle of the day and your system is producing more than your home is consuming and it's sending more back to the grid, what is the price of the tariff of the energy that's going back to the grid? That's the second pricing structure option that's currently in the statute. This is where things like battery storage, all your innovation around grid modernization may come into play. So these are the two options that customers will have. Our goal is to work with the industry and the regulators to get these offers into the market so we can start to work out the kinks, because after 300 megawatts, the market is going to be in this new structure. So we have 90 more megawatts to get to the new structure. We estimate that we will be through that 90 megawatts at the end of 2019, which means we have a year and a half to put some tariff pilot in place, test it, kick it around, see how it's going, adjust it, modify it, and get ready for it to fully roll out post 300 megawatts.
Thanks, Brian. I'll give you a break with this one. This is for Eric. This question has asked, could you please elaborate on the reference that you made to your work with the clean energy developers, where you'll obtain the generation figures for non-program generators, so the wind, CHP, fuel cells, things like that?
We're looking to work with the developers for the projects to figure out how do we best obtain that.
Okay, so not quite determined yet, just
we're still working through it.
Reaching out to developers.
Some things we have a pretty good idea on, and something it's on a project by project basis.
Okay.
Yeah, you could think of those as like, if you've got your Bridgeport fuel cell park, which is a 15 megawatt project that Fuel Cell Energy developed with Dominion, they have their own metering systems that they've got built into the projects. We were a minor investor in that structure, so we don't have our metering in it. So the question for Eric becomes, how do we access their data on a daily basis, monthly basis, whatever makes sense for us? Similar to Colebrook Wind, where we've got an investment alongside Webster Bank and a minority stake in the project. They've all got their own production meters. So the question becomes, how do we interact with the project owners to access that data? What time is it once a year? Is it, so that's really the process.
Okay. And we do have a lot of additional questions coming in on net metering. So I think what we'll do is, as those come in, we'll kind of package them and we'll make a FAQ type of list that comes out when we send the webinar presentation later next week or early next week. Just one moment here while I prepare this next question. Okay, so this question is about SB9 and how it has directed PURA to change the netting frequency for net metering. So, Brian, could you elaborate on that?
Great. So this is kind of like a residential solar 501 kind of question. It's a really in the weeds type of question. When you think of net metering, we've effectively currently got like an annual netting structure. If you've produced more than you've consumed at the end of the year, then whatever you've produced more than you've consumed, you'll get that remaining rate at a wholesale rate. So in the policy discussion, we've got frequency around this new tariff structure around simultaneous netting all the way up to daily netting. There was a debate around whether or not to move it up to monthly netting. So if you think about both of these things, simultaneous netting is when you are consuming what you are producing immediately, right? The daily netting has to do with how are you doing at the end of a day with regards to what you've produced versus what you've consumed. We've taken a look at some of the data for 2 months. We looked at peak months, July and January, to take a look at what the daily production more than consumption looked like. And we believe it's somewhere around 40 to 60%. So the system is producing more than it's simultaneously consuming, anywhere between 40 to 60% over those 2 monthly periods. We're going to be taking a look at all the data by month so we can get a specific number so that we could understand the economics of how this would play into a tariff or a pricing structure. So as we all head into what will be a regulatory tariff setting process, hopefully in the last quarter of this year, we will all have this information around what it looks like across our systems. So we have to do some analyses around it, take a look at what the potential overproduction is on a daily basis, and work from there.
Thanks, Brian. So with that, that seems to be the end of the questions, and we're also out of time. So any additional questions, please email them to us, and we'll prepare them and send them out in the list with the webinar recording. So thanks, everyone, for joining us today, and have a great day.